Hello class, thank you for joining in on our ELA virtual instruction for week 2. This is for the week of March 30th to April 3rd, 2020. Last week I wanted to give you an introduction to our platform. This week we're diving a little bit deeper into our academics and we will access the textbook today. The standard that we are working with this week is our RI 2.5, which is for informational text. Our reading standard for today focuses on us being able to analyze in detail how an author's ideas or claims are developed and refined by particular sentences, paragraphs, or larger portions of the text, which just means sections or chapters. So basically our goal is just to better understand how an author makes his or her point through specific sections within a text. These are the items that you are responsible for this week. You have your attendance question, your achieved article, you have a pre-reading activity which has to do with the text that we're going to read called Deep Survival. You will also have a during reading activity which you will complete while you are reading that text, and you have a post-reading activity to be completed after that text. Lastly, you have your independent reading and log, which you are responsible for every day of the week that you do not do an achieved article. So your first task here, go ahead and log onto Teams and access this and answer this question if you haven't done so already. The question of the week: how are you surviving this quarantine? Go ahead and write and complete sentences and post your answer by April 3rd to be marked present. Pause the video here if you have not done that already. Your second task here is to read the Achieve article, Miracle on the Hudson, and answer the questions. So you are only reading the article and answering the questions. You don't have to do any other portion of the that Achieve thing there. You need to score a 75% or higher for this to count. If you score lower than that, it will be counted either not at all or as the score that you got. Okay, once you are done with that, go ahead and get ready for the bulk of our assignment. Today's focus on our lesson is survival. So just look at the world around us today. We are all in a state of survival right now, and our world is changing rapidly as we all kind of fight to stay safe and even alive. By definition, survival is the state or fact of continuing to live or exist, typically in spite of an accident, ordeal, or difficult circumstance. So let's take a look at a few incredible acts of survival that we've seen throughout history, which are actually hard to believe really happened. So I want you guys to check out this YouTube video here. It's called 10 Survival Stories That Actually Happened, by accessing this link. So when you open up the PowerPoint on Teams or from Focus, you can copy and paste this link into your browser. So sit tight, it's about 13 minutes long, but please do watch the whole thing because you will have a pre-reading activity to complete afterwards. While you are viewing this video, imagine each person's mindsets and actions that help them in their fight for survival. What would you have done? Okay, so go ahead and pause this video now and watch that YouTube video, and I'll see you back on the assignment. Okay, so once you have finished looking at that video, I want you guys to knock out this pre-reading activity. This is assignment 2A. As you already know, strong readers always activate their background knowledge and make personal connections to any text that they read. So go ahead and access this assignment if you have not already and put it up on your screen. Follow along as I read the directions. Think about a time in which you witnessed or experienced being in a battle for survival. You may choose to consider an example from the video that you just watched. What actions or mindsets do you believe led to their or your success in staying alive? Feel free to use bullet points for a quick list or jot down a few sentences below. Take about 10 minutes to think through and complete this activity before you jump into the text with me. When you're done, join me back in the slideshow. You may pause the video here as you jot those answers down. All right, welcome back, class. I said before that our focus for this week is the standard RI 2.5, which analyzes an author's ideas or claims. So let's clarify the larger question that we have to understand when we're reading this text called Deep Survival. The essential question is what we have to answer by the end of the lesson. So based on the anecdotes referenced in Lawrence Gonzalez's writing, Deep Survival, what actions and or mindsets does Gonzalez believe are essential to one's survival? As a side note, anecdotes are short stories about an incident or person, so just little small stories that he is going to talk about. While reading, we must ask ourselves, through each anecdote, what does Gonzalez reveal about each person's actions or mindsets in their quest for survival? And also, what does he encourage or discourage when one is faced with the fight to stay alive? Okay, now let's access the text, and I'm going to show you how to do that in case you forget. So I'm going to minimize this here. I'm going to pull up my web browser, and remember, I know that I have to complete the during reading activity, which I'm just going to put up right here. I'm going to make this smaller. I'm going to make my screens sit side by side. That way I'm able to work on this together. Okay, so once I get to the DCPS website here, I'm going to click on popular links, go to blended learning, scroll down to where it says My HRW right here. I'm going to click on this little picture. Click on my DCPS login. And I'm going to click on the student ebook. This should already be up on your site, as it were. Okay. Now, my page is already up here because I viewed this text when preparing this lesson, but I know that you guys don't have it up yet. So I'm going to jump up here and just kind of click over here, and I'm going to type in 325. That is the page number that it's on. I'm just going to press go to page, and it'll bring you to this page. I'm also going to switch my page view because this looks really small to me and I'm not really able to read it. So I'm just going to click on this one here, scrolling, which just makes my text a little bit bigger here. Let's see here. There we go. All right, let's see if that works. Kind of works. Back to 320. Sorry guys, technical difficulties as usual. All right. Okay, there's my text. So I want you guys to flip over here. I want you to follow along as I read the directions for this activity. This is assignment 2B. While reading Lawrence Gonzalez's Deep Survival, complete the graphic organizer below, taking note of each person's actions and mindsets through the anecdotes provided in the text. In some cases, these actions and mindsets are explicitly stated, while at other times they are implied and require you to make an inference. Include the page and line numbers for your reference, as it will be helpful later in completing assignment 2C. You'll see that our graphic organizer already has identified the people in the anecdotes that Lawrence Gonzalez mentions in the text. That's all these people right here. While you are reading, we're going to run into actions and mindsets for each person mentioned within the text, which are Ronald D. Francesco and victims of the World Trade Center, Byron Kearns and James Stockdale. You also have this person here, Julianne Kopke. I will model how to complete this assignment by pulling out a few actions that I recognize that this person here, Julianne Kopke, took in her fight to stay alive. Remember that some actions or mindsets will be stated explicitly while others will be implied. One final note before reading, there will be times where Gonzalez shows us that what one shouldn't do in their fight for survival, and we want to acknowledge those details as well. All right, ready to start? Let's go back over here to our text. I'll give you a moment to locate it if you need to. All right, so I'm going to start here. This is Deep Survival. It's called Science Writing by Lawrence Gonzalez. Julianne Kopke was flying with her mother and 90 other passengers on Christmas Eve 1971 when lightning struck, causing an extensive structural failure on the Lockheed Electra. Julianne fell out of the broken airplane into the Peruvian jungle. She was 17 years old. wearing her Catholic confirmation dress and white high heels. Miraculously, she suffered only cuts and a broken collarbone from the crash. Later, she reported feeling a hefty concussion. Then she was falling toward the jungle. As she recalled, I remember thinking that the jungle trees below looked just like cauliflowers. To someone who knows about survival, the statement is telling. She wasn't screaming. She wasn't in a panic. She was in wonder at the world in which she found herself. Okay, now here I see that it says that Julianne didn't scream. She wasn't screaming and wasn't in a panic. So that's indicating her mindset, right? It's showing that she wasn't freaking out at all. So I'm going to add that to my graphic organizer because remember, this is what we're looking for here is these actions or mindset. So all I'm going to do here is I'm going to copy. Hopefully this will work. Oh, it doesn't. So we're going to have to type it out here. So I'm going to add this here. She wasn't screaming and wasn't in a panic. Okay, that comes from lines 11 through 12. I want to make sure that I cite that. Okay, that's obviously an indication that the author is like, okay, obviously that's essential to survival is to not freak out and to not panic. Okay, let's continue. She was taking it all in, touching her new reality, checking out her environment while falling. Amazing cool. Amazing and also characteristic of a true survivor, Bill Garlib, an American GI who survived the Bataan Death March in the Philippines, found his senses increasingly sharp as he experienced a deep wonder at the birds and colors and smells of the jungle. Okay, this one here, I like this part here. Here it states that she is kind of embracing her surroundings, right? She's not really freaking out. She'd just fallen out of a plane. I want you to remember that. How would you feel if you just fell out of a plane? Would you be taking the time to look at your surroundings? I know that I wouldn't, so I'm definitely going to add that to my graphic organizer because it indicates her action. She just dropped from the plane as the plane was crashing and she takes in her surroundings. So I'm going to add that here. Her surroundings, while falling. Okay, that's line, let's see, 10, 11, 12. That's line 13. Okay. So let's continue here. I already read this paragraph and I jumped back a little bit because I had a second thought about that here. Okay, we are on line 19. A dozen other passengers survived the mid-air disintegration of Julianne's plane and their attitude, and hence their behavior and fate were quite different from hers. Julianne awoke along the floor of the jungle, still strapped into her seat. There was no sign of her mother, who'd been beside her in the plane. She spent the night trying to keep out of the rain under her seat. The next day she deduced, and let's click on that, and once again we can see some vocab words here. Deduce means to know through reason or logical conclusion. That even helicopters and airplanes she could hear wouldn't be able to see her through this jungle canopy. She'd have to get herself out. It was another important moment. She didn't spend time bemoaning her fate. She looked to herself, took responsibility, made a plan. I think that's obviously a really, really good line there. She didn't start freaking out about her quote fate, right? She didn't panic. So I'm going to add that to my graphic organizer as well. She didn't panic, didn't use those words, freak out about her fate. She made a plan. That is line 28 through 29. Her parents were researchers who worked in the jungle, and she was familiar with that environment, but Julianne had no survival training. She didn't know where she was or which way she ought to go, but her father had told her that if she went downhill, she'd find water. He'd said that rivers usually led to civilization, and while that strategy can just as easily lead into a swamp, at least she made a plan that she believed in. She had a task. Meanwhile, the others who had lived through the fall decided to await rescue, which is not necessarily a bad idea either. But expecting someone else to take responsibility for your well-being can be fatal. In Alive, Piers Paul tells the story of the survivors of another airplane crash, this one in the Andes. Everyone who survived the crash stayed put, assuming that they'd be rescued. Many died. The others wound up eating each other to keep from starving before someone finally walked out and found help. Julianne had nothing except a few pieces of candy and some small cakes. She had no survival equipment, no tools, no compass or map, none of the things I'd been taught to use in survival school. But she very deliberately set up a program for herself. She set off, resting through the heat of the day and traveling during cooler periods. She walked for 11 days through the dense jungle while being literally eaten alive by leeches and strange tropical insects which bored into her, laid their eggs, and produced worms that hatched and tunneled out through her skin. Eventually, she came to a hut along the banks of the river she'd been following. She staggered and collapsed inside. There is always a lot of chance involved in a survival situation, both good luck and bad. It was Julianne's good fortune that 3 hunters turned up the next day and delivered her to a local doctor. But as Louise Pasteur said, luck favors the prepared mind. Okay, now remember, as we're filling out this graphic organizer, the intent is to find actions or mindsets that indicate survival. So while these 2 paragraphs here talk about her actions, I'm not going to add them because it just kind of says what happened. It doesn't say anything about how this talks about survival and what the author thinks it is a good way to survive. Okay. Let's see here. Tough and clear-headed, this teenage girl who had lost her shoes, not to mention her mother, on the first day, saved herself. The other survivors took the same 11 days to sit down and die. The forces that put them there were beyond their control, but the course of events for those who found themselves alive on the hold on a sec. My thing's freaking out again. On the ground, here we go. Those that found themselves alive on the ground were the result of deep and personal individual reactions to a new environment. The naughtiest mystery of survival is how one unequipped, ill-prepared 17-year-old girl gets out alive, and a dozen adults in similar circumstances, better equipped, do not. But the deeper I've gone into the study of survival, the more sense such outcomes make. Making fire, building shelter, finding food, signaling, navigation, none of that mattered to Julianne's survival. Although we cannot know what the others who survived the fall were thinking and deciding, it's possible that they knew they were supposed to stay put and await rescue. They were rule followers and it killed them. Okay, so we know that Julianne is the one that survived. Okay, those other people that did survive the actual fall, the initial fall, they stayed put and then they died. Okay, so I'm going to add this here because remember the other thing that we're supposed to be looking at is things that you're not supposed to do. Okay, other things that he says not to do. So I'm going to add that here. It shows that Juliana, this part here shows that Juliana is not a rule follower, and because of that, she survived. So I'm going to add that to my graphic organizer here. I'm going to say Juliana is not a rule follower, and because of this, she survived. That is from lines, let's see, 75 to 76. So I finished this part here, okay, for Julianne. There are plenty more that you can find here. And if you feel like you find a really good one, just go ahead and click on this. You're going to hover over this here, and you're going to click on the add, and it'll just add a box down below, okay? And you are more than welcome to add more to that, okay? So I am going to keep reading. I filled up that graphic organizer part for this person here, Julianne Kupke. I'm going to continue reading out loud, but your task is to complete the rest of the people mentioned. So these people mentioned here. When you come across an action or mindset that you feel relates to survival the way we just did here, I want you to pause the video and add it to your graphic organizer. That way I'm not reading over you trying to write. Okay, so let's continue with the text. For me, I'm going to minimize this just to make it a little easier in terms of the instruction here. Okay. In the World Trade Center disaster, many people were used to following the rules and died because they did what they were told by authority figures. An employee of the Aon Insurance Company on the 93rd floor of the South Tower had begun his escape but returned to his office after the security guards made a general announcement that the building was safe and that people should stay inside until they were told to leave. Before he died, he spoke to his father on the phone. "Why did I listen to them? I shouldn't have." Another man, an employee of Fuji Bank, actually reached the ground floor lobby, only to be sent back in by a security guard. A third worker called a family member and recorded a final message on the answering machine. "I can't go anywhere because they told us not to move. I have to wait for the firefighters." In thinking for herself, Julianne wasn't even particularly brave. Survival is not about bravery and heroics. Heroes can be perfect heroes and wind up dead. By definition, survivors must live. Julianne was afraid most of the time of everything from piranhas when she had to wade in the water, to the worms that were crawling around under her skin, to the real or imagined creatures of the forest. Survivors aren't fearless. They use fear. They turn it into anger and focus. This is definitely a really good one right here, just as a hint. Conversely, searchers are always amazed to find people who have died while in possession of everything they needed to survive. John Leach writes that victims have been recovered from life rafts with a survival box containing flares, rations, first aid kit, and so on, unopened and the necessary contents unused. Some people just give up, Ken Hill told me, referring to his search and rescue operations in Nova Scotia. 15 years I've been studying this and I can't figure out why. What saved Julianne was an inner resource, a state of mind. She certainly didn't have any physical equipment, but she'd been prepared mentally somehow. A lifetime of experience shapes us to meet or be crushed by such challenges as a bad divorce, the shattering of a career, a terrible illness or accident, a collapsing economy, a war, prison camp, the death of a loved one, or being stranded in the jungle. I went to survival school to try and understand that mystery and see if I could master my own journey. We took off from Pittsfield, Massachusetts, sharing the flying duties, and landed in Lynchburg, Virginia. As I climbed out of the cockpit and onto the wing, I caught my first glimpse of our instructor. Byron Kearns runs the Mountain Shepherd Survival School. He swaggered across the fueling ramp toward us wearing an 18-inch Panamanian machete on his belt, a big, macho-looking guy with 12 years of military experience, including a stint with the Marines. He had worked at the famous Air Force Survival School in Washington State. When I saw him, I thought, we're in for it now. That night, Byron explained that we were going to head off into the Virginia woods the next morning early. We'd be drilling for several days on such matters as map and compass work, firecraft, shelter, and signaling. We'd learn to find water or distill it from the air. Distill means to transform vapor into liquid. We would not think about food because it wasn't necessary. The Air Force plan was that you'd be found within 3 days. Your job, he said, is to stay alive for 72 hours. When he left, Jonas said, "This guy's going to whip you like a red-headed stepchild." Early the next morning, as we moved up Rocky River drainage through the mountains, I noticed that Kearns would stop frequently to point out something of beauty or interest. He spoke softly, as if we were in a church. He laughed a lot. He liked to be still and just think or smoke a cigarette. I saw no sign of the drill sergeant I'd expected. In our first exercise, Kearns asked me and Jonas to make a fire, and in a matter of minutes we had a roaring blaze going. Kearns had turned away to get something from his pack. When he turned back, the flames were leaping several feet off the ground. "Whoa," he said, laughing. "Easy, easy. I just wanted to know if you could start a fire. Some people can't." Then he gently separated the pile of wood and put it out. Byron Kearns turned out to be soft-spoken, polite, cheerfully earnest, and gentle to a fault. He moved slowly, never hurried, and always carefully assessing himself and his environment. He wasn't prone to high emotional states. He carried with him a contagious air of calm. He reminded me of my father, actually. Like so many retired pilots, my father wore soft shoes, talked softly, and walked slowly. As a pilot, you want to wear soft shoes so that you can feel the rudder pedals. You don't want to make sudden, unplanned motions in a combat aircraft cockpit where the controls are sensitive and a lot of things can explode. That demeanor, which means attitude or perceived behavior, so that behavior, once learned under the penalty of death, is carried through the rest of your life. Kearns also had that quiet, dark, and private humor. Even after a lifetime in the wilderness, Kearns entered the woods with a deep sense of respect and humility. Like a man approaching a magnificent, dangerous, and unpredictable creature, it's the same way a good pilot approaches his aircraft. As we worked in the wilderness learning technical skills, Kearns kept talking about positive mental attitude. It was the number one item on the checklist that he'd given us, and that checklist was from the big daddy of all checklist writers, the U.S. Air Force. Positive mental attitude. It must be important, I told Jonas. Yeah, but what is it? He asked. Think good thoughts and you'll be saved? I'd rather have a chainsaw and a cheeseburger, Jonas said. A cell phone and a GPS would be nice too. As we slogged through the woods practicing firecraft, shelter making, knots, and navigation, I kept asking Kearns, but he couldn't explain it. Nobody could. It meant the difference between life and death. He could tell me that. He had an adult portion of it. He assured me of that. It's not what's in your pack, he'd say. It's what's in here, he'd tap his chest. No wonder Tom Wolfe had called it the right stuff. You couldn't exactly title a book Positive Mental Attitude now, could you? Kearns didn't always have it, though. He had to acquire it. Early on in his Air Force days, he took a group of pilots into the mountains near Spokane for several training maneuvers. I was a greenhorn and just misjudged our situation, he told us. Back then, he was pretending to be the macho drill instructor I'd expected. Go, go, push, push, push. He was not yet cool. He was acting cool. His class had been crossing a vast field of slushy snow, which made the going rough. The pilots began to suffer from fatigue, but Kearns kept driving them. I now realize that was a mistake, he said. As the temperature dropped, the darkness came down like a curtain. Suddenly, everyone wanted to give up. They just sat down and lost all their will. Apathy is a typical reaction to any sort of disaster, and if you're exhausted in a field of snow at sundown in the mountains, you're pretty much about to witness the simple disaster of nature separating you permanently from everything you know and love in this world. That apathy can rapidly lead to complete psychological deterioration. Then you sit down and hypothermia sets in, which produces more apathy, a more profound psychological deterioration, and ultimately death. Okay, obviously this paragraph here is talking about what not to do, so you can definitely add that into your graphic organizer. Fatigue almost always comes as a surprise. It is as much a psychological condition as a physical one, and scientists have struggled without success to understand it. It's like the difficulty of studying sand in order to understand the sand pile effect. There's nothing in the muscles or nerves or either biochemistry of the body that would seem to predict or explain fatigue. Once fatigue sets in, though, it's almost impossible to recover from it under survival conditions. It is not just a matter of being tired. It's more like a spiritual collapse, and recovery requires more than food and rest. Following the explosive burst of activity that is sometimes required for survival, or in the panic stage when you're running or climbing or swimming, you're like a woman who has just given birth to a baby. You're depleted and wide open to fatigue. It may take weeks to recover. If you're not taking care of yourself, that fatigue can lead to an inability to sleep, which in turn can result in a sudden psychological collapse. The physical and psychological factors rapidly erode each other, which means they kind of deteriorate each other or eat at each other, which is why it is so important to pace yourself, rest frequently, and stay hydrated. That's why Kearns pushing the pilot so hard had been a mistake. There is something else not to do. A survival situation is a ticking clock. You have only so much stored energy and water, and every time you exert yourself, you're using it up. The trick is to become extremely stingy with your scarce resources, balancing risk and reward, investing only efforts that offer the biggest return. Okay, here's something that you should do. In survival situations, people greatly underestimate the need for rest. While Kearns, Jonas, and I were doing map and compass exercises, he would frequently stop and look around at the woods, chatting with us. I'd be thinking, let's go, I know the way, and he'd just stand there. Now I understand why. You should operate at about 60% of your normal level of activity, he explained, and rest and rehydrate frequently. If the weather is cool and you're sweating, you're working too hard. When Kearns at last realized how serious his situation was with his fatigued Air Force pilots, he recounted, "I fell to my knees and I prayed." Faith is very important in your will to survive. As Peter Lashak put it, whether a deity is actually listening or not, there is value in formally announcing your deeds, desires, worries, sins, and goals in a focused, prayerful attitude. Only when you are aware can you take action. Survival psychologists have observed the same thing. Kearns added, "All at once it hit me that I might actually lose them. Those million-dollar pilots could die." By chance, he found a fence and he used the cedar post to start a fire. Chance is nothing more than opportunity, and it is all around at every turn. The trick lies in recognizing it. It's amazing to see what fire can do. You're out in the woods, you're cold, you're lost, you're lonely, but the minute you light that fire, you're home. The lights are on and supper's cooking. It made a world of difference from going from complete darkness to light and warmth. It just turned everybody around. Kearns learned many lessons that night. His mastery and confidence turned the pilots around even more than the fire. It showed them the way, and it made Kearns more able to save himself. That lesson was driven home again and again. Helping someone else is the best way to ensure your own survival. Okay, that one is said to you verbatim. You should definitely write that one down. It takes you out of yourself. It helps you to rise above your fears. Now you're a rescuer, not a victim. And seeing how your leadership and skill buoy each other's up gives you more focus and energy to persevere. The cycle reinforces itself. You buoy them up, and their response buoys you up. Buoy just means like raises you up. Many people who survive alone report that they're doing it for someone else, a wife, boyfriend, mother, son, back home. When Antoine de Saint-Exupéry was lost in the Libyan desert, it was the thought of his wife's suffering that kept him going. In the 84th floor offices of the World Trade Center's South Tower, and an hour before the collapse, Ronald DeFrancesco was one of the people who met Brian Clark, the fire warden with a flashlight who was asking people, "Up or down?" DeFrancesco went up, hoping to find air. But after 10 or so floors, he encountered people who were succumbing to fatigue and smoke. The people up and falling asleep. DeFrancesco, too, was collapsing. But then he said to himself, "I've got to see my wife and kids again." And with that, he got up, bolted down the stairs to safety. Doctors and nurses often survive better than others because they have someone to help. They have a well-defined purpose. Purpose is a big part of survival, but it must be accompanied by work. Grace without good works is not salvation. The survivor plans by getting small, manageable goals and then systematically achieving them. Hence, the Air Force checklist and the notion which my father drilled into me: plan the flight and fly the plan, but don't fall in love with the plan. Be open to a changing world and let go of the plan when necessary so that you can make a new plan. Then, as the world and then plan go through both their book changes, you will always be ready to do the next right thing. People are animals with animal instincts, but they lack many of the survival mechanisms animals possess, such as fur to keep them warm, fangs and claws, and flight or speed. Culture creates a collective survival mechanism for the species. People survive better in numbers. They survive because they use cognition to organize, say for a hunt, and to make things, even as cognitions inhibit their animalness, including strength. That's why, when cognition is turned off, people are amazed by their own strength. Because cognition continuously inhibits it, that is the whole secret to cognition. It is a mechanism for modulating emotional, physical responses. Every culture evolves survival rituals. Some, especially non-technical ones, are devoted to not much more than survival. In Native American cultures, one ritual is the vision quest, in which a young person goes into the wild and fasts in search of a vision. It can be seen as a type of survival training, for there is no food, no water, no way a person has already practiced sitting still and making the best of the situation. He'll have confidence in his ability to survive it. The survival lessons that apply today are ancient. The Tao Te Ching is broken into two parts: integrity and the way, which can be thought as the two halves surviving anything. Lao Tzu's book is a handbook for a ruler, but it is also a handbook for the brain. An imbalance of the brain's functions leads us to trouble, and a triumph of balance gets us out. I've found similar lessons in Epictetus, Herodotus, Thucydides, the Bible, the Bhagavad Gita. Sorry if I mispronounced those. Is there anything whereof it may be said, see, this is new, says Ecclesiastes. But there are always new people who haven't heard that there's nothing new under the sun, and there's always someone who doesn't get the word. I had always wondered where our American survival rituals were. I think now that they're everywhere around us. The Boy Scouts in its original conception has a survival school. Sports are survival training in that they teach strength, agility, strategy, and the endurance of pain. But our culture is filled with survival stories as well. Pool is the ultimate American conception of survival model. James Stockdale, here's your last person, a fighter pilot who was shot down over Vietnam in 1965, spoke many times about how he survived 7.5 years in a prison camp. One should include a course of familiarization with pain, he said. Stockdale observed, you have to practice hurting. There is no question about it. You have to practice being hazed. You have to learn to take a bunch of junk and accept it with a sense of humor. He's talking about being cool just as he was when his F-8 fighter bomber was hit with a 57 millimeter fire. He had been on a relaxed bomb run at the time. He'd even taken off his uncomfortable oxygen mask. I could barely keep that plane from flying into the ground while I got that damned oxygen mask to my mouth so I could tell my wingman that I was about to eject. What rotten luck. And on a milk run. My mind was clear, and I said to myself, 5 years. I knew we were making mess of the war in Southeast Asia, but I didn't think it would last longer than that. The Spartan practice of enduring the bite of the fox is a course of familiarization with pain. Then there are the schools like Kearns, which attempt to teach wilderness survival by directly meeting the problem head-on with Yankee ingenuity. Like being lost, survival is a transformation. Being a leader can ensure that when you reach the final stage of that metamorphosis, it is with an attitude of commitment, not resignation. The transformation of survival is permanent. People who have had the experience often go on to become the best search and rescue professionals. They have come to understand, perhaps unconsciously, that they can live only fully by helping others through that same transformation. All the survivors I've talked to have told me how horrible the experience was, but they have also told me, often with deep puzzlement, how beautiful it was. They wouldn't trade the experience for anything in the world. It gradually dawned on me that only by researching and dissecting the mysterious quality the Air Force so duly called positive mental attitude would I ever understand survival. And I thought, wait a minute, my father was in the Army Air Corps. Maybe that's what he had that allowed him to live. If so, he'd certainly never talked about it. But what pilot would? I felt as if I'd stepped at the edge of everything that I had been after all my life. Here, concealed in the most unimaginative phrase possible, was the deep mystery I'd been trying to unravel. Okay, so go ahead and add any additional thoughts that you want to in that graphic organizer, this one here. Okay, before returning to my presentation, that slideshow. So just add any additional actions or mindsets that you observed. Go ahead and pause your video if you need more time. Okay, I hope you enjoyed reading that text with me. This is an incredibly relevant text for our lives today. I know you probably think it's a little bit dry, but just think about how we are trying to survive this global pandemic of COVID-19. So this really hits home for me, especially now that we're all quarantined. So if you're ready to move forward and you finish that last part of assignment 2B, go ahead and move on to assignment 2C, which is this one here. This is your post-reading activity. This will take you probably the majority of your time. Go ahead and follow along as I read the instructions here. I'm going to pull them up right here. Okay. Based on Reading Deep Survival by Lawrence Gonzalez, what is his definition of survival? Use at least 3 examples from different anecdotes in the text to support your analysis. Be sure to explain how each anecdote shapes Gonzalez's definition of survival. You are encouraged to utilize your graphic organizer to assist in crafting your response. Be sure to use the recesses writing strategy shown below to build your response. Your thoroughly written paragraph should be approximately 10 to 12 sentences. So you don't have to label your sentences or separate them into chunks like the model shows down here. This is just to give you kind of an indication of how you should be writing. Just keep it all thoughtfully crafted into one coherent paragraph. Just make it one paragraph. This assignment will probably take you around 20 to 30 minutes to complete if you've effectively completed this part here. So use the quotes that are in here to for your sites. That'll help you out, okay? You can start with those and then go around there. So if you are in need of assistance, go ahead and reach out to me during the daily virtual meeting. You can also request a conference. That you are more than welcome to do that. You're just going to type your response here. Okay. So once you are finished with that, you're of course going to work on your reading log. So this is for the days that you don't do the Achieve article. So if you worked on this on Monday, you would only be reading for 4 days per week. Make sure that you are reading 20 to 30 minutes of independent reading. Something that came up last week, or people were reading like 4 different books, or they were saying that they're reading 4 different books. Don't do that. Stick with one book and fill out your log under that assignment 2D, which is right here. So I should see 1 book per week. Okay. You can even, if it takes you longer to read a book, you can continue with that same book the next week. That's fine. I do not want to see multiple books here because that means that you're not reading anything other than a couple of pages, and that's not, you know, in any way entertaining. Okay. So I appreciate you guys watching this video and engaging in our virtual classroom for this week. Don't forget that this assignment is due on Friday the 3rd. Stay tuned for our next lesson, which will be available to you each Monday. I hope you guys have a great rest of the week, and don't forget to smile today.